Before we begin today's story, I'd like to welcome you to Family Shadows, a place where we share moving tales about love, sacrifice, and the quiet strength of family. If you believe that every parent's love deserves to be remembered, if you've ever felt the weight of unspoken gratitude for your father or mother, then this is the channel for you. Take a moment to subscribe and join us. Each story here is more than just words. It's a reminder that family bonds can both wound and heal, that shadows often hold the brightest lessons. And now, let us begin. Today's story is called, "They Said My Job Wasn't Good Enough, So I Showed Them Who Built Their Life." Robert Hayes had never been the kind of man people noticed when he walked into a room. He was not loud, not polished, not the sort of figure whose presence commanded instant respect. He was, as his late wife Sophia once described him with a soft smile, the steady heartbeat in the background. At 62, Robert carried himself the way working men often did, shoulders slightly stooped from years of labor, hands weathered and scarred from calluses that no cream could soften, and eyes that seemed to always search the horizon as though calculating how much daylight was left to finish the job. His neighbors knew him as the man who rose before dawn, coffee in hand, steel-toed boots on his feet and a thermos tucked under his arm. They'd see him in the truck, an old Ford that coughed when it started, with paint faded to a gray that matched the early morning mist. Some waved politely, others didn't notice, but Robert never minded. Attention was never what he sought. For more than 4 decades, Robert had worked in construction. He had poured foundations, laid bricks, installed beams that kissed the sky. He had been there in summer's blistering heat, in winter's biting cold, and in the rainstorms that turned job sites into rivers of mud. He had built homes, schools, churches, places that held people's most sacred moments. And yet when asked about his profession, he would only shrug and say, "I'm in construction." There was no grandeur in his voice, no attempt to dress up the truth, because Robert didn't see himself as anything extraordinary. He was just a man who worked with his hands to provide for his family. Robert's story began long before his children were born. In the quiet corners of his youth, he learned what it meant to struggle. His father had been a mechanic, his mother a seamstress. There were no diplomas hanging on their walls, no impressive titles before their names. What they had was grit, and that was enough. He remembered nights when the kitchen lights flickered because the bill was overdue, when dinner was more bread than meat, when Christmas gifts were patched up hand-me-downs wrapped with more love than paper. It was from those roots that Robert carried forward his belief: work hard, stay honest, and your family will never go hungry. And he kept that promise. When Sophia came into his life, she was the light he never thought he deserved. Where Robert was quiet, she was radiant. Where his world was built of bricks and beams, hers was filled with color and song. She had faith in him more than he ever had in himself. When they married, she told him, "You don't need to be grand, Robert. You just need to be present." So he was, every day, every year, until the very end. Sophia's passing had left an ache in Robert's chest that never dulled. Some nights when the house was too quiet, he would still set 2 cups of tea on the table by habit. And then he'd sit alone, staring at the steam rising, remembering her laughter. Robert had one daughter, Emily. She had inherited her mother's eyes, bright and piercing, but somewhere along the way she had also inherited the world's impatience. Emily had always been ambitious, determined to climb further than her parents ever could. And Robert encouraged her. He worked longer hours, skipped vacations, and put away every spare dollar to send her to college. He stood in the shadows as she earned her degrees, cheered the loudest at her graduation, and smiled when she introduced him to Mark, the man who would later become her husband. Mark Lewis came from a family of professionals, attorneys, bankers, polished individuals who wore suits like second skin. He was charismatic, educated, and always spoke as though the world were a stage. Robert respected him, but he also felt the unspoken judgment that hovered whenever Mark's family was around. They asked polite questions about Robert's line of work, but their smiles carried a condescension he had grown used to over the years. Robert didn't mind for himself, but he hoped Emily didn't see him through their eyes. Yet, as the years went on, he began to notice subtle things. The way Emily sometimes corrected his manners at the dinner table, the way Mark would gently steer conversations away from Robert's stories, as though construction work were too small a subject for discussion. And then, one evening, the words came. Words Robert would carry with him like stones in his chest. It was a Friday night when Robert was invited to Emily and Mark's home. They lived in a newly developed neighborhood, modern homes with clean lines, large windows, and driveways big enough for 3 cars. Robert had noticed, with a quiet pride, that the houses stood on land his company had helped develop years ago. He never mentioned it. That evening, the dining room was filled with the aroma of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes. The table was set with polished silverware and wine glasses that shimmered under the chandelier. Robert, in his usual collared shirt and worn khakis, felt slightly out of place. As they ate, conversation drifted from Emily's promotion at work to Mark's latest business deal. Robert listened, nodding politely, happy simply to be near his family. And then Emily, with a sigh, said something that made his fork pause midair. "You know, Dad," she began, "sometimes I wish you'd done something more." Robert blinked. "More? You know, something that doesn't feel so ordinary. Mark's family, they're all professionals. Lawyers, doctors. I mean, construction is fine." But she trailed off, exchanging a look with her husband. Mark, never one to stay silent, added, "It's just that in today's world, manual labor doesn't really hold the same prestige, Mr. Hayes. I mean, you worked hard, sure, but it's not exactly the kind of legacy people look up to." The words hit Robert harder than they knew. He tried to smile, though his chest felt tight. "Well," he said softly, "I suppose someone has to build the walls that hold up your offices, too." Emily chuckled nervously, but the tension in the air was sharp. That night, Robert went home to his empty house. He poured himself a glass of water, sat in his recliner, and stared at the framed photo of Sophia on the mantel. Her smile seemed to whisper the words she once told him, "You are enough." But for the first time, Robert wondered if his daughter believed that anymore. In the weeks that followed, Robert noticed more. Invitations grew less frequent, phone calls shorter. When family gatherings did happen, he felt like a background character, there to fill a chair but not truly seen. And yet, he never complained. That was Robert's way. He carried his hurts in silence, just as he carried beams across job sites, steady and unshaken. Still, deep down, a quiet question burned. Had all his sacrifices been invisible? The following Sunday, Robert received a call from Emily. Her voice, polite but distant, carried a tone that was more obligation than warmth. "Dad, we're having dinner here this week. You should come by, 6 o'clock. Robert paused, the receiver pressed against his ear. He could hear clattering in the background Mark's voice, the faint hum of a television. He cleared his throat. "Of course. I'll bring dessert," he said. When he arrived at their home that evening, the sun was just sinking behind the rows of new houses. The streets were clean, lined with identical manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. Children on scooters raced past him, their laughter echoing in the open air. Robert parked his old Ford pickup at the end of the driveway, careful not to block the sleek black Lexus that gleamed in front of the garage. Inside, the house smelled of rosemary chicken and freshly baked bread. Emily greeted him with a polite kiss on the cheek. She was dressed in a fitted navy dress, her hair pinned back neatly, every inch the professional woman she had become. "Hi, Dad, come in." Robert smiled, handing her a pie he had picked up from the local bakery. He had thought of baking one himself, the way Sophia used to, but he knew his attempts would only fall short of the memory. "Thank you," Emily said, taking the pie without much glance. In the living room, Mark was pouring wine into tall glasses. His tie was loosened, his cufflinks still in place as if he had come straight from a boardroom. He looked up and offered a grin that was more courteous than genuine. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his tone clipped. "Glad you could make it." Robert nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." They moved into the dining room, where the table was already set. Crystal glasses sparkled under the chandelier. Robert took his seat, feeling the unfamiliar stiffness of the chair beneath him. He placed his napkin carefully on his lap and waited. The conversation began with small talk. Emily spoke of her latest project at work, her voice rising with excitement as she described the recognition she had received from her boss. Mark followed with a story about a successful negotiation he had led, dropping terms like equity leverage and market expansion, as though the words themselves were currency. Robert listened, nodding, smiling where appropriate. He was proud of his daughter, truly. Proud of her drive, her ambition. Proud that she had reached heights he had never dreamed of. But as the minutes ticked by, he noticed how the rhythm of the conversation kept him on the outside, circling like a guest rather than belonging at the table. At one point, Emily turned to him, fork poised in midair. "Dad, you've been quiet. How's work?" Robert looked down at his plate. The chicken was tender, the potatoes whipped smooth. He thought about the job site he had been on that morning, the dust, the clang of metal, the sweat rolling down his back as he guided a younger worker on how to level a beam. He thought about the satisfaction he had felt when the structure finally stood steady and true. "It's going," he said simply. "We just finished laying the foundation for a new school." Emily smiled faintly, but her eyes flicked toward Mark as if to signal the subject wasn't quite worthy of lingering on. Mark leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "Construction must be steady work. A lot of lifting, I imagine. Long hours." Robert nodded. "Yes, long hours, but worth it." Mark chuckled, not unkindly but with an edge that made Robert's chest tighten. "Well, as long as you enjoy it. Personally, I can't imagine spending decades out in the sun breaking my back, but I suppose everyone finds their own way." Emily laughed softly, almost apologetically. "Mark, don't." Robert smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. He cut another piece of chicken and chewed slowly, the voices around him fading into a blur. The rest of the evening passed in much the same way. Stories that skimmed past him, polite acknowledgments that never quite landed. When dessert was served, Emily placed the bakery pie in the center of the table, but it was barely touched. They were too full, they said. Afterward, Robert excused himself early. He kissed his granddaughter Lily good night, her small arms clinging to his neck, her innocent smile a balm he didn't know he needed. She whispered, "Love you, Grandpa," and the words nearly undid him. He walked back to his truck, the cool night air biting at his cheeks. Through the front window, he saw the three of them laughing together, glasses raised in a toast. He placed his hands on the steering wheel, rough fingers gripping leather worn smooth by years of use. For the first time in a long while, Robert wondered if there was a place for him at his own daughter's table. On Monday morning, Robert woke before dawn as he always did. The alarm buzzed at 5:15, but truth be told, he had been awake long before. He lay in the dim quiet of his bedroom, listening to the soft creaks of the old house, wood settling, pipes sighing, the faint rustle of wind through the trees outside. He dressed in the familiar rhythm, work pants, faded flannel shirt, steel-toed boots by the door. His hands moved automatically, muscle memory carved over decades. He poured black coffee into his thermos, set out a sandwich wrapped in wax paper, and picked up the lunchbox that had traveled with him to countless job sites. The house felt cavernous without Sophia's voice drifting through the kitchen. Sometimes in the half-light, Robert almost expected to see her, apron tied at the waist, humming as she cooked breakfast. But the counters stayed bare, the air silent. He shook off the thought, grabbed his keys, and stepped out into the cool dawn. At the construction site, the world was already stirring. Trucks pulled in, headlights cutting across the gravel. Men in hard hats called out greetings, their voices rough from sleep but laced with camaraderie. Robert felt the familiar rhythm of belonging here in a way he no longer felt at Emily's table. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," one of the younger workers, a kid named Danny, called out. "Ready to teach us old tricks again?" Robert smiled, adjusting his gloves. "They're not old tricks if they still work." For the next 8 hours, he was absorbed in the labor that had always been his sanctuary, measuring beams, steadying ladders, correcting mistakes with patience. Here, among dust and steel, he was respected. His men listened when he spoke. They called him sir not because of titles or degrees, but because he had earned it with years of sweat, with knowledge that only time could carve into a man's bones. And yet, even here, the echo of Emily's words followed him. Something more, not the kind of legacy people look up to. At lunch, he sat on the edge of a half-built wall, unwrapping his sandwich. The sun warmed his back, and for a moment he closed his eyes, remembering a long-ago afternoon when Emily was a little girl. She had visited him at a site, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her hair in pigtails, shoes covered in dust because she insisted on following him everywhere. "Daddy builds houses," she had told a friend proudly. "Daddy makes places for people to live." Back then, she had looked at him with eyes full of wonder. Now those same eyes looked at him with a faint trace of embarrassment. Somewhere between then and now, he had stopped being someone she admired and started being someone she tolerated. Robert chewed slowly, forcing himself to swallow against the tightness in his throat. He reminded himself, as Sophia once had, that love often hid behind harsh words, that people sometimes forgot their roots until life reminded them. That night, Emily called again. "Dad, we're having a small get-together on Friday," she said. "Mark's parents are coming. It would be nice if you joined." Robert hesitated. He could still hear the sting of their last dinner, the weight of words that had cut deeper than they realized. But he didn't want to give Emily more reason to see him as distant. "I'll be there," he said softly. Friday came, and with it a nervousness Robert couldn't shake. He stood before the mirror longer than usual, combing his thinning hair, adjusting his shirt. He pulled out an old blazer from the back of the closet. Sophia had bought it for him years ago, insisting he needed something proper for special occasions. The fabric smelled faintly of cedar from the closet, and when he slipped it on, he felt the ghost of her approval. At Emily's house, the atmosphere was even more polished than before. The dining table shimmered with fine china, wine glasses lined like soldiers. Mark's parents sat near the head, dressed elegantly, their voices carrying the easy confidence of people accustomed to being listened to. When Robert entered, Emily smiled, though it was the kind of smile meant for photographs, tight at the edges, practiced. "Dad, you made it," she said, kissing his cheek lightly. "Come sit." Throughout dinner, Robert did what he had always done. He smiled. He smiled when Mark's father bragged about his years in corporate law, when Mark's mother reminisced about trips to Europe, when Emily chimed in about her own promotion. He even smiled when subtle jabs were made about blue-collar work, and the kind of jobs that don't leave much legacy. Inside, each word scraped against him like sandpaper, but outwardly he forced the same polite expression, unwilling to let them see the sting. At one point, Lily, sweet, innocent Lily, looked up from her plate and said, "Mommy told me Grandpa just works with his hands, but I think his hands are strong." The room fell awkwardly silent. Emily hushed her quickly, embarrassed. Mark cleared his throat and changed the subject. Robert kept smiling, though his chest felt heavy. He kept smiling as the laughter returned around him, kept smiling as the glasses clinked in toast, kept smiling even as he realized he was nothing more than an accessory at his own family's table. Later, when he returned home, he sat in the recliner, blazer still on, tie still knotted. He looked at the photo of Sophia on the mantel, her eyes alive with the warmth he had lost at that dinner table. For a long time he didn't move. He just sat there, wearing the forced smile long after the house had gone dark. The following week passed slowly, every day weighed down by an echo of Friday night. Robert worked as he always did, arriving before sunrise, leaving after dusk, but even in the noise of hammers and drills, the voices from that dining room lingered in his head. When he was younger, words had never cut him deeply. Men on job sites teased, strangers dismissed, but none of it ever mattered. He had his family then, Sophia's voice to remind him of his worth, Emily's childhood laughter echoing through the house. What did it matter what the world thought when his little girl once believed he was the strongest man alive? But now the judgment came not from strangers, but from those closest to him. It was harder to ignore when it came wrapped in his daughter's voice. On Wednesday, he stopped by Emily's house after work, carrying a bag of fresh peaches from a farmer's stand by the highway. Sophia used to love those peaches, and Robert thought Emily and Lily might enjoy them too. When he rang the doorbell, Emily opened the door but looked surprised, almost caught off guard. "Dad," she said, glancing over her shoulder, "you didn't call." Robert held up the bag with a small smile. "Brought some peaches. Thought Lily might like them." Emily hesitated. Behind her, Robert could see Mark in the living room, his tie loosened, drink in hand. The television flickered, with a news anchor's voice. "That's thoughtful," Emily said, taking the bag. She offered a quick kiss on his cheek. "But tonight's not a good time. We've got people coming over in a bit." Robert nodded, his smile steady though his stomach sank. "Of course, another time." "Thanks, Dad," she said, and closed the door gently. He stood there for a moment, the porch light buzzing above him, before walking back to his truck. The peaches were out of his hands, but the weight remained heavy in his chest. That night, he sat alone in his kitchen, staring at the empty chair across from him. He sliced a peach for himself, the juice running down his fingers, and remembered how Sophia used to laugh when he dripped it on his shirt. He could almost hear her voice teasing him, almost feel her hand reaching for his across the table. But there was no laughter now, only silence. By Friday, Robert had resolved not to stop by again without calling. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to be the father who overstayed his welcome. Still, the ache lingered. That weekend, he was invited again, though not directly. Emily called with a rushed tone, asking if he could help fix a few things before the in-laws arrived. "Dad, the faucet in the guest bathroom is leaking, and Mark said the patio door is sticking. Could you come by Saturday morning?" Robert agreed. Helping was what he knew best. When he arrived, toolbox in hand, the house was already buzzing. Emily was in the kitchen preparing food. Mark's parents were in the living room, sipping coffee, flipping through a magazine on interior design. "Ah, Mr. Hayes," Mark's father said with a polite nod, glancing at the toolbox. "Here to save the day, I see." The words weren't cruel, but they carried a sting all the same, an acknowledgement of his role as useful but not equal. Robert bent to his work without reply. He tightened the faucet, adjusted the patio door, wiped his hands on a rag. Emily thanked him, kissed his cheek quickly, then rushed back to the kitchen. Mark ushered him out of the way with a cheerful, "Thanks, Mr. Hayes, we'll handle the rest." Robert packed his tools slowly, his chest tightening. It was as though he had become a hired hand in the very family he had built his life around. He forced a smile when Lily came bounding over, wrapping her arms around his waist. "Grandpa fixed the door," she shouted proudly. Robert crouched, kissed her forehead. "That's right, sweetheart." But when he stood again, the adults were already moving on, their voices flowing past him like he wasn't even there. Driving home that afternoon, Robert stared at his calloused hands on the steering wheel. He had built more than doors and faucets. He had built homes, neighborhoods, lives. And yet here in his daughter's world, his value was reduced to the quiet man with a toolbox. The cut was silent, almost invisible, but it sank deeper than any blade. The next time Robert joined them was on a Sunday evening. Emily had insisted he come. It was Lily's turn to present her little art project from school, and she wanted her grandfather there. The thought warmed him. At least in his granddaughter's world, he was still wanted. He wore the same blazer Sophia had bought him years ago. The shoulders didn't quite sit right anymore, but he tugged at the sleeves until they seemed acceptable. Before stepping out of the house, paused at the mantel, touching his fingers lightly against Sophia's photograph. "You be proud of her, Soph," he murmured. "Our Emily, she's done well." The picture, of course, gave no reply. When he arrived at Emily's house, the smell of roasted vegetables filled the air. Laughter drifted from the living room, Mark's laugh, booming and confident, followed by Emily's lighter notes. Robert stepped in, announced softly that he was there, but his voice was drowned out by conversation. It wasn't until Lily spotted him that the room shifted. "Grandpa!" she cried, racing across the floor to throw her arms around his waist. Robert's smile came easily then, genuine and deep. He lifted her, kissing her cheek as she giggled. For a moment, all the aches dissolved. Dinner began soon after. The table, as always, gleamed with glassware and polish. Robert found his place at the far end, across from Lily, who swung her legs under the chair, humming a little tune only she knew. Conversation flowed like it always did, circling around topics Robert couldn't quite catch. Mark's firm acquiring new clients, Emily's department winning awards, Mark's parents discussing their upcoming trip to Italy. Robert nodded, smiled, sipped his water. At one point, Lily held up a drawing she had made in class. It was a house, crooked lines, windows uneven but full of color. "This is where we live," she declared proudly. Everyone leaned in to look. Emily laughed. "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Tell us about it." Lily pointed at the roof. "Mommy and Daddy live here, and I live here, and Grandpa," she paused, frowned as though recalling something. "Mommy said Grandpa just works with his hands, so I put his toolbox next to the house." The words landed with the soft thud of a hammer hitting a nail, unassuming but undeniable. The table went silent. Mark's fork clinked against his plate. Emily's smile froze, the color rising in her cheeks. "Lily," she said quickly, a little too sharp. "Eat your food." But Robert couldn't move. His gaze lingered on the crooked little house drawn in crayon with the tiny square box beside it. A toolbox. That was how his granddaughter saw him, not as the man who had built neighborhoods, who had sacrificed everything for the roof above their heads, but as the shadowy figure with tools forever on the outside. He forced a smile then, the same practiced expression he'd worn at every dinner. "That's a fine drawing, Lily," he said softly, his voice steady though his heart ached. "Grandpa's proud of you." She beamed, oblivious to the tension around her. The adults shifted uncomfortably, conversation limping forward. Mark cleared his throat and spoke of markets again. Emily busied herself with the bread basket. Robert ate quietly, though each bite tasted like ash. Later, as he drove home, Lily's words replayed in his mind. "Just works with his hands." He looked at those hands gripping the wheel, scarred, knotted, calloused. Hands that had built Emily's childhood bedroom. Hands that had held Sophia's when she was sick. Hands that had signed every tuition check, that had lifted every weight so his daughter could climb higher. If all the world saw in him now was a toolbox, perhaps it was time to remind them what those hands had truly built. The idea came to Robert one night as he sat at his kitchen table, the peach pit from his half-eaten fruit resting in the bowl before him. The house was dark except for the soft glow of a single lamp. He had been turning over Lily's words in his mind. Grandpa just works with his hands, and with each repetition the ache shifted into something sharper. Not anger, not pride either, something quieter. A resolve, perhaps. He thought of Sophia again, her laughter, her certainty in him. She used to tell him, "One day, Rob, you'll see. What you've built isn't just wood and nails, it's a legacy." He never believed her fully. He thought of himself as a man who paid the bills, kept roofs from leaking, and raised his daughter the best he knew how. But what if Sophia had been right all along? That Friday, Robert walked into his office, the modest one above the Hayes construction warehouse, where blueprints were stacked in cabinets and the air always smelled faintly of sawdust. His foreman, Carl, a broad-shouldered man with gray in his beard, looked up from a roll of plans. "Morning, boss," Carl greeted. Robert nodded. "Morning, how's the prep for Sunday?" "All set," Carl replied. "Catering's confirmed, presses lined up, banners are ready. We'll have the stage built by Saturday afternoon." Robert stood silently for a moment, staring at the blueprints spread across the desk. They weren't just drawings, they were maps of futures, schools, homes, community centers, places people would gather, live, grow. He tapped the paper lightly with his calloused hand. "Good. This one matters." When he left the office, he carried with him a small stack of invitations, simple cards printed with neat lettering announcing the opening gala of a new housing project in the city. Hayes Construction was sponsoring the event, though nowhere on the card did it mention Robert's name. He had always preferred anonymity. Let the company shine, not the man. But this time he intended for the truth to be seen. That evening he stopped by Emily's house. She opened the door, surprise flickering across her face again. "Dad," she said cautiously. Robert held out the envelope. "I wanted to give this to you in person." She took it, eyebrows knitting as she read. "A gala for a housing project." "Yes," Robert said simply. "This Sunday I'd like you, Mark, and Lily to come." Emily hesitated. "Dad, I don't know if Mark has." Robert placed a hand gently on her shoulder, steady and calm. "It would mean a lot if you were there." Something in his voice silenced her protest. She looked at him the way she used to when she was younger and still leaned on his judgment. Slowly she nodded. "All right," she said quietly, "we'll come." That night Robert sat again in his recliner, the house quiet around him. He looked at Sophia's photo on the mantel, her smile soft as ever. "This one's for you, Soph," he whispered. "For them to see, for them to remember." And as the hours ticked by for the first time in years, Robert felt something stir inside him. Not the heaviness of exclusion, not the ache of disappointment, but a quiet anticipation. The stage was being set. They would see him not as a man with only a toolbox. They would see him as the man who had built the very foundation of their lives. Sunday came dressed in autumn light, the sky painted with a clean blue that felt sharper than usual. Robert rose early, though he had barely slept. He ironed his shirt with care, pressing out every crease as Sophia once had. His blazer was brushed, his shoes polished as best as they could be, though the leather still bore the scuffs of years. He stood before the mirror and straightened his tie, nodding once at the reflection staring back at him. "You'll do," he murmured quietly, almost as if Sophia were there to confirm it. By late afternoon, cars streamed toward the new Civic Center downtown. Banners hung across the entrance. Hayes Construction welcomes you. The name stretched bold against the fabric, flapping in the breeze like a silent declaration. Emily and Mark arrived in their Lexus, Lily bouncing in the back seat. Emily wore a tailored cream dress, pearls at her neck. Mark adjusted his cufflinks as they walked, his parents trailing beside them, their voices pitched with polite curiosity. "This looks larger than I expected," Mark's mother remarked, glancing at the valet who took their keys. A construction company throwing a gala. Inside, the hall was alive with movement. Round tables draped in white cloth stood beneath chandeliers. Waiters glided between guests with trays of wine and hors d'oeuvres, and a string quartet played softly from the corner. City officials mingled with business leaders, voices low and measured. Emily paused just inside the doorway, blinking as she took it in. She turned to Mark, whispering, "Dad invited us to this." Mark raised an eyebrow, scanning the room. "Strange. I didn't know your father had ties to something like this." Then they saw him. Robert stood near the stage at the front of the hall, speaking quietly with the mayor. He was dressed in that same blazer, but somehow in this space it looked different on him. Fitting. His shoulders seemed straighter, his presence calmer, as though this hall was not foreign ground but his own home. Emily blinked again, confusion flickering across her face. She had never seen her father in this kind of setting, among officials, businessmen, people who carried the weight of influence. "Grandpa." Lily's voice carried across the room. She wriggled free from Emily's hand and ran forward. Robert bent down to catch her, his smile unguarded, warm. For a moment, the grandeur of the hall faded, and all that remained was a man and his granddaughter. When Robert straightened, he caught Emily's eye. He gave a small nod, calm, inviting her closer. She led the rest of the family toward him, unease tugging at her steps. "Dad," she said quietly when they reached him, "what is this?" Robert placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip steady. "It's something I've been meaning to show you." Before she could ask more, the lights dimmed slightly, and an announcer's voice rose from the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight to celebrate the launch of the newest community project, one that will bring homes, schools, and parks to thousands of families in our city. None of this would be possible without the vision and dedication of Hayes Construction." Applause rippled through the crowd. Emily felt her stomach tighten. She glanced at Mark, whose brow furrowed in dawning realization. The announcer continued, voice steady and proud. "And now, it is my honor to welcome to the stage the man behind it all, the founder and president of Hayes Construction, Mr. Robert Hayes." There was a moment of stillness, as if the words had to sink in. Then the crowd erupted in applause. Emily froze. Her mouth parted slightly, but no sound came. She turned, staring at her father as he released Lily gently into her arms and began walking toward the stage. Mark's parents exchanged startled looks. Mark himself sat rigid, eyes fixed on Robert's back as he climbed the steps, shoulders square, every movement calm and certain. Robert reached the podium. He paused, surveying the hall, the faces turned toward him. For 62 years he had lived in the shadows, content to let his work speak quietly, content to let his family shine while he remained unseen. But tonight, at last, they would see him. The applause swelled and then softened, settling into a hum of expectancy. Robert adjusted the microphone, the bright lights washing over his face. For a moment he stood in silence, gazing at the crowd. His eyes scanned the sea of strangers, then found the small cluster where his daughter sat, stiff and wide-eyed, Mark at her side, Lily perched on her lap. He cleared his throat. His voice, when it came, was not polished like a politician's nor commanding like a corporate executive's. It was steady, warm, and worn with years of use, like a familiar tool, simple but enduring. "Good evening," he began. "I don't stand behind podiums often. Most of my life, I've been standing behind beams and scaffolds instead, so if I stumble over words, bear with me." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the hall. Robert's lips curved faintly, but his eyes stayed steady. "When I was a boy, my father fixed cars and my mother sewed dresses. They worked hard, long hours, and never once complained. They didn't have titles or accolades, but they gave me something more valuable. An example. They taught me that dignity doesn't come from the job you have, but from the honesty you put into it. He paused, letting the words settle. So when I was old enough, I picked up a hammer, and I never put it down. Over the years, I built houses, schools, churches. I didn't think of it as building legacies or leaving marks. I just thought of it as giving families a place to belong. That was enough for me. He let his gaze drift back to Emily. For just a second, his eyes softened, and though his voice never wavered, his heart spoke through every word. But somewhere along the way, Robert continued, this work became more than one man with a hammer. It became a company. A company of good men and women who have poured their sweat into making dreams stand tall. That company is Hayes Construction. And tonight, we celebrate the beginning of our newest community, over 500 homes, a new elementary school, and 3 public parks. Applause broke again, louder this time. City officials clapped enthusiastically. Reporters scribbled notes. But Robert only heard the quiet in his daughter's row, the silence that followed revelation. He waited, then leaned closer to the microphone. His voice lowered, carrying weight now. I've heard it said that some jobs aren't good enough, that working with your hands is ordinary. But I'll tell you this, the very roofs that keep the rain from your heads, the very walls that hold your laughter, the very streets you drive on, they were built by hands like mine, ordinary hands, calloused hands, hands that care more about holding steady than looking fine. The hall stilled. Some guests nodded, some leaned forward. Emily's chest rose and fell quickly. Mark's parents exchanged uneasy glances, shifting in their seats. Robert took a breath, his voice softer now, almost tender. My late wife used to remind me that a family isn't built on titles or prestige. It's built on love, on sacrifice, on being there day in and day out. That's what I've tried to give, not just through these buildings, but to my daughter, to my granddaughter, to my family. He looked at Lily then. Her small face was lit with awe, her eyes wide as though seeing him for the first time. She clapped her little hands, breaking the hush, and the sound made Robert's heart swell. The audience followed, applause thundering once more, echoing against the high ceilings. Robert stepped back from the podium, his expression calm, his posture firm. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just the quiet man at the table, the afterthought, the background. He was the guest of honor, and the truth of who he was could no longer be hidden. When the applause softened and guests began to mingle again, Robert stepped away from the podium. Several city officials shook his hand. A local journalist asked for a quote. Business leaders leaned in with admiration. Robert answered politely, but his eyes kept wandering back to the table where his daughter sat. Emily's face was pale, her hands resting stiffly in her lap. Mark leaned close, whispering something she didn't seem to hear. Mark's parents kept their expressions neutral, though a faint unease flickered around their eyes. But Lily, sweet Lily, was bouncing with excitement, waving eagerly at her grandfather like he was the star of a school play. Robert excused himself from the crowd and returned to his family. He stood before them quietly, the noise of the hall humming around them. Emily rose slowly from her chair. Dad, her voice caught. I didn't know. Robert smiled faintly. You weren't supposed to. I didn't build Hayes Construction so my family would boast at dinner tables. I built it so people would have somewhere to live, so children could go to schools with strong roofs. That's always been enough for me. Emily's eyes welled, though she blinked quickly to hide it. All those years, you never said a word. Robert looked down at his hands, scarred and strong. What mattered was that you had the chance to go further than me. You did. That's what your mother and I wanted. At the mention of Sophia, silence wrapped around them like a heavy quilt. Emily's shoulders softened, the defenses she carried melting away for just a moment. Mom would have been proud, she whispered. Robert's throat tightened. He nodded. She already was. They sat together for a while at the edge of the bustling gala. Robert began to share fragments of memories, ones Emily had never heard. He told her about the early days when Hayes Construction was just him and 2 friends with a borrowed pickup, laying bricks until their backs nearly broke. How he used to sleep in his truck to save on gas when projects were far from home. how Sophia packed him sandwiches, slipping notes of encouragement into his lunchbox when money was tight. He spoke of the first house he ever built on his own, the nervous pride he felt when the family walked in, children racing down the hallway, their laughter echoing off the walls he had raised. Emily listened, her fork untouched on her plate, her gaze never leaving his face. For the first time in years, she wasn't seeing a man in worn khakis who arrived in an old Ford. She was seeing the architect of her childhood's security, the quiet builder who had never once asked for thanks. At one point, Robert pulled a worn envelope from his inside pocket. He handed it to her gently. Inside was a faded photograph, Emily at age 5, sitting on a half-built foundation, her hair tied in messy pigtails, her feet dangling above the dirt. Beside her stood Robert, hammer in hand, dust clinging to his shirt but smiling wider than in any picture Emily had seen since. "Your mother took this," Robert said softly. "You told her that day Daddy builds castles. She laughed for hours about it, said we'd never forget." Emily pressed the photo to her chest. Her voice trembled. "I had forgotten." Robert placed a hand on her shoulder, firm and forgiving. "That's all right. Life makes us forget. Tonight was just my way of reminding you." For a long time, neither spoke. Around them the gala moved on, wine glasses clinking, speeches made, laughter rising. But in that small circle of stillness, Emily's heart shifted. She realized that the man she had judged as ordinary had carried an extraordinary weight all his life, quietly, without complaint and without asking for recognition. And for the first time in years, she felt ashamed, not of him but of herself. When the gala ended and the hall began to empty, Robert lingered near the edge of the stage. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, watching as guests filed out into the crisp night. Many stopped to shake his hand again, their words heavy with respect. "Congratulations, Mr. Hayes. Remarkable work. You've left a mark on this city." But the words that mattered most were still unsaid, and he knew it. At their table, Emily sat holding the photograph he had given her. She hadn't let it go once, her thumb tracing the edges as though afraid it might disappear. Her eyes, once so quick to glance away in embarrassment when others spoke of ordinary work, now couldn't look at anything but the image of her father, hammer in hand, smile lit by pride. Mark stood stiff beside her, his jaw set, cufflinks gleaming under the dim light. He had been unusually quiet since Robert's speech, his confidence muted. When Robert walked toward them, Emily rose immediately. Her voice was soft, hesitant. "Dad, I don't know what to say." Robert shook his head gently. "You don't need to say anything, just knowing you were here was enough." But Emily wasn't satisfied. Tears welled in her eyes, and for once she didn't blink them back. "I spent years letting other people's opinions color the way I saw you. I let myself forget who you really are. And tonight," her voice broke, "tonight I realized how blind I've been." Robert placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "You're not blind, Emily. You're just living in a world that tells you worth comes from titles and appearances. But life will remind you, it always does, that what truly matters can't be measured that way." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a moment she was no longer the polished professional in pearls, but the little girl who once called him the man who built castles. Then, to Robert's surprise, Mark stepped forward. He looked uncomfortable, his polished words failing him for the first time. He cleared his throat, glanced at Emily, then back at Robert. "Mr. Hayes, Robert," his voice faltered. "I owe you an apology." Robert raised an eyebrow but said nothing, letting him continue. "I've spent years thinking I was better than you because of what I do, because I sit in an office while you worked in the sun. I thought prestige mattered more than sweat. But tonight I realized my family lives in a house you built. My daughter plays in a neighborhood your company created. Every wall that protects us was raised by hands like yours, and I've been arrogant enough to look down on that." The words hung heavy in the air. Robert studied him for a long moment. Mark's face was tight, his eyes hard, but beneath them lay something genuine, a crack in the armor of pride. Finally, Robert gave a small nod. "It takes strength to admit that, Mark, more than you know." Mark looked down, ashamed. Lily, still clutching her drawing, climbed into Robert's lap then, oblivious to the heaviness in the room. She pressed the picture against his chest. "Grandpa, can you help me build a bigger house next time? One with a garden and a swing." Robert chuckled softly, kissing the top of her head. "We'll build anything you want, sweetheart." Emily watched the scene unfold, her eyes glistening. She realized with sudden clarity that her daughter would grow up proud to say her grandfather was a builder, that innocence hadn't yet been corrupted by the world's obsession with prestige. And for the first time in years, Emily felt something more than shame. She felt regret. Regret for every time she had corrected her father at the table, for every time she had silenced his stories, for every time she had treated his presence as an afterthought. But within that regret, a seed of gratitude began to grow. The following Friday evening, Robert found himself back at Emily's house. But this time, everything felt different. When he pulled into the driveway, Emily was already waiting at the door. No awkward hesitation, no half-hearted smile, just her standing there, arms folded tightly as if she had been rehearsing how to welcome him back. When he stepped out of the truck, she hurried forward and embraced him. "Dad," she whispered, her voice thick. "I'm glad you're here." Robert held her for a moment, the simple warmth of the gesture enough to steady him. He had been to this house many times before, but tonight he didn't feel like an intruder. Tonight he felt like family. Inside, the dining room glowed with softer light. The chandelier wasn't set to its full brightness, and candles flickered gently on the table. The china was still there, but there was no stiffness in its placement. Emily had cooked herself instead of ordering catering. The smell of roast chicken mingled with herbs and vegetables, rich and comforting. "Grandpa," Lily squealed, rushing forward. She leapt into his arms with such force that Robert had to steady himself. Her hair smelled of shampoo and crayons, and she pressed her face into his neck. "You came." "Of course I did," Robert said, setting her down. "Wouldn't miss it." Mark emerged from the kitchen carrying a bowl of salad. He looked different, not in his suit, not hidden behind polish. He wore a simple sweater, sleeves rolled, eyes more humble than Robert had ever seen. He gave a small nod. "Mr. Hayes, Robert, good to see you." Robert studied him for a second, then nodded back. "Good to see you too, Mark." Dinner began with none of the usual distance. The conversation didn't swirl past Robert this time. It included him. Emily asked about his projects, not with polite detachment, but with genuine curiosity. She wanted to know how houses were designed to last, how neighborhoods were planned, how he had managed the early years of the company. Robert spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. For decades, he had held these stories close, never imagining they mattered. But now, in the warmth of his daughter's eyes, he found himself telling them as if they were treasures. Lily, of course, chimed in every chance she got. "Grandpa builds castles," she announced proudly, clutching her drawing from the week before. "One day he'll build me a treehouse castle too." Everyone laughed, and for once the laughter wasn't at Robert's expense. It was shared, light, filling the room like a melody long forgotten. At one point, Emily set down her fork and looked at her father. Her eyes shimmered, though her smile held steady. "Dad, I need to say this. I'm sorry for every time I made you feel small, for letting other people's opinions make me forget who you are. You've given me everything: college, a home, a chance at the life I have. And I sat here and treated you like you didn't belong. I can't take that back, but I don't want to live another day pretending you're anything less than extraordinary." The words hung in the quiet. Robert didn't rush to respond. He simply reached across the table, placing his weathered hand over hers. His touch was firm, forgiving. "You don't need to apologize, Emily," he said softly. "I've never wanted your praise. All I ever wanted was for you to be happy, safe, and strong, and you are. That's enough." Emily covered her mouth with her free hand, tears spilling freely now. Mark spoke then, his tone low. "Robert, I've been arrogant. I judged you without ever knowing the truth. But you've built something greater than I'll ever build in a boardroom. You've built lives, and I'll never forget that again." Robert gave a faint smile. "Just remember to teach Lily the same lesson. Worth isn't measured by what's shiny, but by what lasts." The rest of the evening carried a new kind of peace. They ate together without pretense, laughter weaving through conversation, humility softening every word. And when Robert rose to leave, Emily and Mark walked him to the door. Lily clung to his leg, refusing to let go until he promised to come back soon. As Robert stepped into the cool night air, he glanced back once more. The light from the dining room spilled onto the porch, warm and inviting, and for the first time in years, he felt as though the table inside truly had a place set for him. The days after the gala slipped quietly into weeks, but something had shifted in ways Robert never thought possible. Emily called more often now, not just with requests or reminders, but with the kind of small talk she hadn't shared in years. Sometimes she asked him to dinner without pretense, just because. Sometimes she stopped by his house with Lily, who would run straight to his lap, filling the rooms with laughter that had been absent for so long. Mark, too, softened. He no longer avoided Robert's stories. He asked questions, listened, even sought his advice on matters he once dismissed as beneath him. It wasn't an instant transformation. Pride never melts in a single night. But the wall between them had cracked, and through it something genuine began to grow. One Saturday afternoon, Robert found himself in Emily's backyard. The sun was warm, the grass freshly cut, and Lily tugged at his sleeve with excitement. "Grandpa, will you help me build my treehouse castle today?" Robert chuckled, glancing at Mark, who stood nearby with a toolbox in hand. "Looks like we've already got a good start." Together, the three of them worked, Robert steady and sure, Mark following his lead, Lily darting around with toy hammers and more enthusiasm than skill. Emily watched from the porch, arms folded, a soft smile on her lips. For the first time in years, her family felt whole. As the wooden beams took shape, Robert stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. His hands, scarred and strong, were no longer seen as ordinary. They were the hands of the man who had built not only walls and roofs, but a life, one strong enough to hold generations. That night when Robert returned home, he placed Sophia's photograph on the windowsill so it faced the street. He sat in his recliner, looking out at the quiet neighborhood, and whispered softly, "We did it. Soph, they see now, they finally see." He closed his eyes, the weight of years settling gently around him, not as a burden but as a blanket. For Robert Hayes was no longer just the man with a toolbox. He was the man who had built their home. Thank you, dear friends, for spending your time with this story here on Family Shadows. May it remind us all never to judge worth by titles or appearances, but by the love, sacrifice, and dignity a person carries quietly in their life. I wish you good health, peace of mind, and the warmth of a happy family gathered around your own table. Until the next story, take care and cherish one another.